We have a special treat for you today here on Oklahoma Gardening. We're visiting the garden of Professor Raymond Case here in Stillwater. And Professor Case is retired from OSU's Horticulture Department, and many of you remember him fondly as longtime host of Oklahoma Gardening. Hi, Professor Case.
Greetings, Sue. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it. Yes, I did do that, and I enjoyed it immensely.
Great. Well, let's see now. When you did Oklahoma Gardening, you didn't have the luxury of a studio garden right here in town, did you?
That is right. Two things. I went to Oklahoma City to the main station, and we had a garden there. The one thing we didn't have that you have are cordless mics.
Oh, yeah.
And I felt kind of like someone was about to be hung sometime when your cords would get hung up. But it was a great time, and I enjoyed it immensely, and I developed a lot of friends from it.
Sure. Yeah, it's a wonderful experience.
Yes, right.
Well, I understand that you've been hybridizing hibiscus lately.
Well, there's a lot of things you're interested in, and one thing that this past year I found rather interesting was taking the varieties, and I have here 5 different varieties that I then chose to cross one with another, and each of these was crossed with each other. And that was last year. I saved the seed, took it in the greenhouse and planted it, and these plants grew from that, and they're in bloom this year. And this is the diversity of color we happen to get from that. I had no idea what I would get, but
it's beautiful.
It's kind of fun.
Yeah, and you can see some crosses in here.
Yes,
clearly.
Between the flower and the foliage, because there's differences in foliage between this one and the others, but it's rather enjoyable.
Now, a lot of gardeners have never done any hybridizing of flowers. They may have read about it. How do you go about that?
Well, first you have to recognize which are the male and female parts of the flower, and
sure,
get the pollen in the right place.
Yeah, with
Let me just
hibiscus,
take one
it's easy
like
to
this,
see it.
for example. It just bloomed out today, and if I wanted to hybridize this one, first thing I do is cut off all those petals, because I don't want too many insects being attracted to it.
Sure.
And this is the male part of the flower, and this is the female part right here in the center. I wouldn't, usually what a legitimate plant breeder will do will be remove the male material, since this is still attached to the plant. Then I will take one of these varieties that I would want to and come over and possibly not do anything with it at all, but just brush that pollen on the female part of this flower. And in that case, we have effected pollination. Now, if it combines, then it's fertilization, and then we'll get seed set. I'll come back later in the year, take off that pod, and since this is in the cotton family, we would expect a pod, kind of like a bowl of cotton.
Sure.
Or a bowl before it opens. There's no fiber in it. And as I say, these are things that have come out of it. And I will be interested in seeing that these get a good home.
Oh, yeah. Well, they are
I suspect we'll have a
beautiful.
number of them in the park here in Stillwater.
And one thing we want to emphasize that these are hardy hibiscus.
These are hardy. They are not the tropical. They die back to the ground each winter. Just like you'd expect asparagus to die back.
Sure,
You
right.
cut the old tops off, they come up in the spring, and some of the plants I have in the yard have been with me more than 35 years.
Oh, well,
So they are hardy.
sure, and a wonderful addition to the landscape.
Right, right.
Well, you have a beautiful yard around here. Would you show us around?
I'd love to. You might like to look at the hibiscus a bit. On the other hand, if you've got another one you'd rather see first, why, you choose it.
Oh, I'm anxious to learn about this border
All
over
right,
here and how
fine.
you've mixed the colors. Well, Professor Case, at this season of the year, it looks like you still have a lot of color in your garden.
Yes, you can get it 2 ways, with annuals and perennials, and I choose to mix them together. The little yellow daisy there is a perennial, and it's been in bloom now for over 2 months.
Well, that's beautiful, and I'm back in the shade. It surprises me at how the color just jumps out at you.
But it happens to be a wildflower here in Oklahoma as well, so I'm real pleased to have something that's compatible in the yard.
Sure. Now that is a perennial.
Correct,
Right.
correct. It is a rudbeckia.
That is beautiful. And, along in here, you filled in with some annuals that are lower growing.
Yes.
How do you decide? You have so many different species of plants you work with. How do you decide your placement of one color next to another and all?
I suspect in part it just happens to turn out lucky. But yes, you do want a group with regards to heights and colors and that sort of thing. But when you get these colors together, there aren't too many of them that clash.
Sure.
So you can put reds and yellows and things like that together more so. And this is, of course, our native wildflower.
Oh, yeah, state wildflower, was it Indian blanket?
Yes, right. Gaillardia.
Now your iris look like they're going
Yes,
by the
this is the
wayside.
time of the year when you're probably going to think about dividing and planting in other places, and you may have already touched upon that.
Oh, okay.
Here's another native there, a native of Oklahoma, the verbena.
The verbena. We see
Purple
that a lot
verbena.
on roadsides, I guess, in well-drained
Yes, exactly.
areas. Now, what is this bright red flower? That's
That
beautiful.
that is an annual form of salvia, and most people think of salvia as being low-growing. This
Right.
is Salvia coccinea, and it's very attractive to hummingbirds. And I let it come up. I didn't plant it. It just comes
Sure.
up many places.
Well, I'm sure that
Right.
gives you a lot of extra height in the garden. though,
Yes, it
some
does.
days.
Sometimes where I don't want it, but that's the way it goes.
Oh, now what? Now this is a larger form.
Yes,
What is this?
that would be the Gloriosa daisy there, and it's a cousin of the perennial we looked at a while ago. They're both rudbeckias. This one, of course, is annual, and it reseeds in there, and I let them do that as much as they would.
Sure. That way you have surprises all summer long. I
Sure.
suppose.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, now along in here, it looks like back in the shade you've put some white flowers.
That happens to be a summer phlox
Okay, sure.
and a white variety. Right.
Well, now down in front of it, you've got some beautiful foliage.
That
Is this
happens
plant-
to be one of the penstemons, and it is a true perennial. Not too many of them are true perennials. Well, some of them are. But this is a young plant. I just planted this spring. I don't intend to see a bloom till next spring.
Sure. Well, that's one thing we want to emphasize, that planting perennials, often you have to look into the future because they don't all bloom
Indeed so.
the first year.
And I hope they're going to be there for a number of years.
Oh, yeah. That's lovely foliage on there.
Purple salvia, another perennial, and it's a variety you get out of the seed catalog. It does very well.
Now that color looks very pretty against the yellow and orange hues
Yes,
in
right,
the background.
right.
That's a nice contrast.
On the other hand, it's very complementary and with the rose-colored verbena there
Sure.
too as well.
Yeah. Oh, blue's a hard color to come by in the garden sometimes.
It
so
is
it's always
that, and
welcome.
I'm really interested in getting as many different ones as I can.
Sure. Well, this is just
And of
beautiful.
course here you've got a red verbena with a purple, or a red geranium with a purple verbena. I'll get it right in a
Well, a
minute.
little bit of white periwinkle.
Yes,
in here
that's right,
too.
right.
So
Bright eyes.
that's your a patriotic part of the garden.
Yes, I suppose.
Well, this is really interesting. Well, you mentioned earlier that it's the time to divide iris. It's also the time to divide daylilies.
Yes, correct.
And
Right.
I understand that Ray is back behind the house
Yes.
in one of your propagation beds.
We're gonna do a bit of that around there.
Okay,
There is a nice daylily here in bloom in the yard right now, and generally we think they're about gone.
sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Professor Kays, I really enjoyed kind of snooping around here in your back area while you and Sue have been looking at some of your flowers out in the front. And I know I visited your place here on several occasions, and I'm continually amazed at all the things you have going on. Back here, it looks like you do a lot of your work as well as have some other things you enjoy, and you're in the process of dividing some perennials, daylilies
Yes,
there.
this happens to be daylilies we have here, and they've been in that location now for probably 5 or 6 years, and they're beginning to get too crowded, and you can usually get a tip-off on that. They bloom, but they don't stay in bloom very long. I mean, maybe 3 weeks and they're gone. And this variety, when it isn't that crowded, may bloom for 2.5 months.
And not just daylilies at this time of the year,
Sure.
but there's also other types of perennials that
Oh,
can
yes.
be divided.
Yes, indeed. The two more notable ones would, of course, be the peonies and the iris. And iris, probably about every 5 years, you're going to have to divide them because they do get pretty thick.
Well, I know we read in some literature, in some popular publications particularly, that a good rule of thumb on dividing perennials is if they flower in the spring, you divide in the fall. If they
Correct.
flower in the fall,
Correct.
you divide in the spring. And that does hold true for many of them.
Yes, that's right. It's at a time when they're at the nearest of a resting stage until you get into winter. And we'd like to get them moved at this time of the year so they can reestablish their root system before winter sets in, because we want them to be off to a running start.
And you can treat these pretty rough.
Oh,
really.
indeed
And
so, right.
How are you going to handle these now?
One
that you've
like
got them
that,
dug.
right. One like this is a rather good-sized clump. I would prefer that we make that 2 or 3 clumps instead of 1 when we plant it. Otherwise, it's going to get crowded pretty fast. And I have one here that I've washed off more of the soil to where we can kind of see what they look like. But this is in the lily family, but it does not produce a bulb as we think of it, like a lily bulb. This is the root system here, and they're rather large and thickly fleshed and all, and these are the storage organs of that particular plant. And in order to get this separated, we're going to have to do two things: wash off much of the soil, and then work these as best we can. And then when you get to the next point, you're probably going to have to come in with a knife and cut them. You think, oh, that's terrible. Well, yes, you're going to damage some of them, but the portions you have left, which would be a portion like this could make enough for a plant, and this will bloom next year. In planting it, we would want to put them into the ground, right where my dirty fingers are there, about to that level. And whether or not we planted them on a mound or just flat on the ground is going to depend somewhat on whether or not it is a fairly loose soil that drains well, or it's a tighter soil such as clay. I'd go on a mound with clay. I'd probably go flat with the sandier soil, well drained. But this would work just fine.
I might want to mention at this point, first case, because you have reminded me of something, that in our county extension offices, we do have a real good USDA publication on perennials, and it talks about dividing perennials and some of these tips, and I think just some of the basic tips, like you mentioned about planting depth and exposure, all that's really important.
Of the three that I mentioned, iris, daylilies, and peonies would require dividing far less. They might go 30 or 40 years before you divide them.
And proper planting depth is much more important with that plant
it's
also.
It's very critical. If the buds on the top end of those roots is more than 2 inches deep, you'll have foliage each year, but you probably won't have blooms. If it were a tight clay soil, I'd probably say cover those buds about 1 inch deep. If it's a sandier soil, I might go 2 inches deep.
I also noticed behind us you've got an interesting looking little nursery bed with a lot of hibiscus and other things. Can we walk over there and take a look at
sure. Let's
some of those things?
Surely.
I also know that one of the things that has always interested me is that you get a real pleasure out of sharing your plants with people. And it looks to me like you've got an awful lot of plants here. I don't know if you're going to be sharing these or not, but obviously with these amaryllis, you're going to be doing something with them.
I've got so doggone many, I'm going to have to be giving a bunch of them away.
What are you doing with these?
These were taken out of the pots this spring and planted out here in the soil without a pot around them, you see. And they're going to develop an extensive root system and grow a very luxuriant top, more so than if they were left in the pot. And yes, these have been fertilized. We keep it mulched so we don't have to pull so much grass and weeds. There's probably 150, 160 of them in here.
Different colors, I'm saying.
Several varieties, right. But some of them propagate very freely. Putting them out like this, the likelihood is that when we go to dig that bulb, there'll be a small bulb or two associated with it. So this is the quickest way of getting an increase instead of keeping them in the pots all summer, planting them out. But these will be dug along in mid to late September. I'll probably dig them with a spading fork and leave them right out here, let them dry a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, whatever it is like that, then take them inside. They cannot stand close to freezing weather. When it gets down to around 40, I want to be sure they're inside, not outside. And then along in late November, probably we'll take them and pot them up and then start them to grow. And somewhere in later winter and spring, we'll have them in bloom. Most of them. A few of these did not bloom this last year, and I was in hopes that I could see them in bloom out here and decide it's this variety or that variety, but it didn't work out that way, but it works out.
Well, this is really interesting. I know it's a real challenge for people to hold their amaryllis over, but they do have to have some special conditions during the growing season, and then of course the dormancy requirement there before they're forced out again. Right. You've got a couple of other things here too that are kind of interesting. Do you use this for a nursery bed?
Well, it just happened to be a handy location here, and it's rather a good deep loamy soil, and this is a good place to grow plants that you want to dig bare root. And over here we have some native persimmons, and they were seedlings last year, so this is their second year of growth. They're about pencil size or a little larger now. Next year, by the end of this growing season, they'll increase in diameter a bit. I'll expect to graft those next year to the Japanese variety.
I see. So this would be a good rootstock for that.
It's an excellent rootstock. In fact, most of them are grafted to that. We happen to have here in Stillwater a Japanese trail in one of our parks, Campbell Trail, and we're going to have a bunch of these along that trail.
That's great. Well, when we read about the early days of Stillwater, and even in the image of some people's minds now, they have Stillwater as a prairie town, and,
Sure.
and maybe in some cases we still are, but it certainly does look like we're on the does not look like we're on the prairie here, because you created a real good microclimate with the trees and the plants and the things that you've done over the years. And I know that, again, back in one area, you have quite a few shade-loving plants.
Yes, yes,
and
right.
Sue is up there again taking a look at those, and I'd like for us to walk up and see what she's found that's interesting up there then.
All right, that's fine.
Well, Professor Case, a lot of people, when they think of planting shrubbery, think of only using them as foundation plantings,
Yes,
little short
right, right.
things in front of their homes. But
Sure.
you've used them as a screening device, I noticed
Yes,
here.
right. This happens to be deciduous holly. It's a male or a female here with berries on, and a male over here, which of course doesn't have any berries. but
Sure. Provides the pollination, though.
It provides quite a lot of screening in there, and then we have some things over here that don't look that great. This happens to be red raspberries underneath the lath shade, but
But this way, they're sort of hidden
Sure,
this late in
sure.
the season. That's a good idea.
Common spirea here, Van Hootie, and it's lovely in the spring in bloom, but 3 weeks and they're gone, but at the same time, it's nice to have.
Sure, it still has a nice mounding
Sure,
type
sure.
growth habit.
Yes, indeed.
Well, Professor Case, this wooded area on the right reminds me of my childhood. Our next door neighbors had a little place like this in
Oh,
their
yes,
yard.
right,
and
right.
It's just so cool and restful feeling. Now tell me about this area. You planted this tree when you
Yeah,
moved
most of the trees in here are ones that I have planted. This was really quite an open area, but I wanted some shade, and certainly on the south side of the house to cool the house as well. And then by having that shade, it gave me an opportunity of planting a lot of different kinds of plants that would be desirable in full sun, you
Oh,
see.
yeah, I've noticed you have a white pine back in there. and
Yes, right.
Your paths are lined with monkey grass, which is
yes,
a
right,
natural
A
delineator.
lot of wood phlox in here that bloom in the spring. They're very, very, very pretty at that time, and they
and
bloom for a
nice.
long period of time.
Yeah, a nice akuba here.
It has done fairly well in here. I did expect it to grow a lot larger than that, but
Well, this is Oklahoma, so there are limits.
right, right.
Now back here, this is that Solomon seal?
Solomon seal, right. This is about the end of its growing season now, and yet this spring it had lovely flowers on it in the shade like this.
Sure.
Try it in the full sun, and it's a total loss.
Yeah, well, I know it.
Columbines, I have quite a few here, as well as out in the open areas.
Now that will grow in either sun or shade?
Yes, that's correct. And this, of course, is lily of the valley, and doesn't bloom for a very long period of time, but it's reminiscent of the wedding.
Oh, I sure. Well, those little blooms, I guess you call them spikes.
Yes, right.
Have a very sweet scent. Though.
Yes, they do. It's very, very pleasant.
nice.
Right, right.
Oh, we hear a lot these days about cottage gardens, people making their homes look like a little cottage area, and that's what this reminds me of.
Oh, yes. That happens to be a native grape called possum grape. The fruit ripens in October. I planted it here to cover this area over the windows, and then there's some picture windows down the way there too. And in the summertime, I want shade. In the wintertime, I'd prefer not to have it. And with a regular awning, I'd have it all the year round. And
Sure.
when it loses its leaves, you can see out very nicely.
Well, that's a great idea, living awning then.
Sure.
And you planted some begonias, I guess, to pick up some color?
Yes,
in here?
that was kind of a bare spot there, and I put a little in to make it look a little better.
Well, last thing I want to mention in this little area is this foliage plant. What is that?
That happens to be a plant. It does bloom. It's called oxeye daisy, but the interesting part about it perhaps is the large leaves and the rather unusual light green color that it has.
Yeah, that's really different for a shady area.
Yes, right. That's right.
Well, over here you have one of my favorites, the hosta.
Yes, that's a more northern climate plant. It does well, fairly well under shade conditions, but I think in much of Oklahoma, you're hoping that it'll do well, and it may not.
Yeah,
Really?
I know. I have a tough time growing it even in Tulsa.
Yes, right.
But this is a stark contrast. You have a golden rain tree right
Yes,
here.
right, right.
And then over here, full sun.
Yes,
Again,
just across the driveway, right? And
Yeah.
it works out fairly well.
some of our gardeners may not recognize this tree.
Well, it's a long way from home. This is the Atlas cedar of the northern mountains of Africa, the Atlas Mountains.
Well, that silvery blue is beautiful next to the phlox.
Yes, it is the substitute I'm using for really some of the blue spruce.
Sure. Yeah, that's very, very pretty. Well, I know now and then with all these trees around, you get a lot of seedlings coming up, and also
That
from
can
the
be a real
shrubs.
problem, and the golden rain tree can be a frustrating experience when I pull out 150 or 200 seedlings each year.
Oh, sure.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to give all those away.
Yes, yes indeed.
Professor Case, if I were in my native land where I was reared, I'd probably call this a sumac, and
Yes,
you would
right.
quickly correct me and say, no, it's sumac.
Sumac.
But it looks a
that's
lot
right.
different than the ones we see native
Yes,
growing in Oklahoma.
yes. This is a compound leaf. It reminds me quite a little bit of a fern, but this is staghorn sumac, and that is the way it's supposed to grow. And it does have a nice fall color. It's an interesting plant. It does sucker. That poses a problem, but I can handle that. I dig them up and give them away.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now, so many gardeners in Oklahoma would like or think they want to have ferns in their garden, but certainly don't
Sure.
have the climate for it. This is a good substitute.
It does look quite good. Right.
When I look at your garden out here, Professor Case, it reminds me of the way sometimes I look through a nursery catalog or a seed catalog. I want some of everything.
Sure, sure.
And you just about have some of everything here. And I know that, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, you enjoy sharing not only your knowledge with people, but also your plants, and that is part of the joy of gardening.
Oh, no question. That's right. My garden isn't landscape, it's planted. And I just wanted one of everything, or more than one perhaps, and this is kind of how it turned out.
Well, we sure appreciate you showing us around today.
It's
just
been my
so
real
pleasant.
pleasure.
Thank
My
you.
real pleasure. I hope you come back.
I wanted to mention before we left that Sue and I both are former students of yours.
Oh,
and I know
indeed so,
there's
right.
many people throughout Oklahoma and indeed the entire nation and other countries besides America that look to you as a mentor because of the training that you gave. And it's, it's just a real pleasure for us. Because of the connection we've had in the past to be here at your home and look through your yard and tell you again how much we appreciate the way that you have helped instruct us in our early years in horticulture.
Well, you're very kind. Very kind. You did well.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.